I want to first introduce Brent Taylor. He's here from MOECC, the Ontario Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, and he works as a water policy analyst. He spent 2 years in Adelaide, Australia, studying and working on water allocation planning in South Australia, and we're very pleased to have you come and share with us today.
Forward, back,
okay.
and the bridge. Laser.
Okay, easy. Thanks. Thanks, Suzanne. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so I've worked at MOECC in water policy for about 15 years, but I've had the good fortune during that time to spend a couple of separate years in Australia. The first of those was in 2007 when I was working on my PhD. And one of the reasons I went to Australia was to do my PhD research on their approach to water allocation planning. As I was tucking my 6-year-old in last night, and he asked me what I was doing today. I told him I had to leave early. So I said I was coming to talk to you folks and going to be talking about Australia. And he says, well, are you going to be telling them about the snakes? And I said, no, I've kind of already planned it out. I'm going to be talking about water. And he goes, well, that's too bad. But so just in honor of Henry, I'm just going to tell him a couple of facts that he repeats to just about everyone he meets. I think I've got this right. Australia has 8 of the 10 most deadly snakes in the world, including the inland taipan, and one drop from that snake would be enough to kill everybody in this room. So there you go. If you learn nothing else from this talk, you now know a little more about snakes. But why Australia? Why was I interested in that? Certainly the southern part of Australia faces extreme dry conditions, prolonged and severe droughts. And so I guess about 25 years ago, there was sort of shift in approach of water management there, from one that was mainly focused on engineering solutions to provide water supply, so from dam construction and transferring water across the landscape, to adapting more of a water allocation, like a demand management type approach, including formally recognizing the environment as a user of the water. So as a result of that, they've started to implement some really innovative approaches from certainly that are interesting to me from a policy point of view. They're testing those things. So it's an interesting place to look at to see in terms of sort of what they're doing, what's working, what's not working, and that kind of thing. So that's why I was interested in going to Australia and why I wanted to do my PhD there. So what I'd like to do today is just to give you an overview of South Australia's water allocation approach. And then I'll focus on talking about the case studies that I did, focusing on how, and Rob talked about this morning, they're starting to do a lot of collaboration there, and collaboration in terms of planning how they allocate water. So I was interested in studying that for my PhD, so I'll spend the second part of my talk just describing my research and some of the things that I found, and I'll try and bring it back from my perspective working in the government in Ontario to try and explain what I see are some lessons we can learn from Australia and from the work that I did there. So as I mentioned, these recent set of reforms in Australia's water management framework started approximately 25 years ago, give or take. One of the major milestones in this reform process was something called the National Water Initiative. And what this was an agreement between the federal government and the state governments to what essentially is a national water policy for Australia. There are many elements to the initiative, but a few that I want to focus on that are particularly relevant to water allocation and my research are a few things. First off, the initiative commits the governments to implementing statutory watershed planning within each state to make sure that their allocation of water is within sustainable limits for that particular resource. And it specifically prescribes that this work has to be done by catchment management authorities, so authorities that are similar to our conservation authorities here in Ontario. They also commits the states to establishing systems of allowing water trading, so trading water rights among users, as well as securing water for the environment. And so states are now implementing policies and frameworks that allow them to implement these aspects in an integrated way to manage water more sustainably. In South Australia, the main piece of legislation that they're using to implement those aspects of the National Water Initiative that I mentioned is their Natural Resources Management Act. And in that, there's a process by which the state can, they refer to it as prescribing a water resource. So this could be a surface water resource, a groundwater resource, or a combination of the two. And these are prescribed in areas where where there's water supply challenges or where aquatic ecosystems are being threatened, or a combination thereof. The prescription process can be initiated by the state, or it can be initiated from the bottom up. There's significant consultation involved in the prescription process, mainly because the default without having an area prescribed is that there's very little management of the water. So there isn't a lot of rules and controls around taking water and using water. So for the people who are using water in that area before prescription, this is a big change and involves a lot of regulation and a huge departure from what they're used to. Once a decision has been made to go ahead and prescribe a resource, that's done through a regulation under the Natural Resources Management Act. Now what happens there is that for every prescribed resource, a water allocation plan has to be developed. And so I'd like to just focus on a few elements of what those include. Now, the plans, as prescribed under the National Water Initiative, the plans are prepared in South Australia by what they refer to as Natural Resources Management Boards. And each plan is individualized, but the state legislation certainly prescribes some basic components that have to be included in the plans, and some of the technical information and technical studies that need to be done to inform the development of the plans. So an important thing that the plans do is that they set environmental water provisions. Now, something important to mention here is that studies are done first to identify what the environmental water requirements are for an area, and then the plan developers go through a consultative, negotiated process to determine, of those requirements, what are they actually going to provide in their plans. And there's an important difference there, and there's a lot that is brought into that process in terms of what the objectives are of the local water users, what the state and national objectives are for protecting water within that area. And so what happened from my experience is that what the studies or the technical studies show is required to preserve an environment in an area isn't always what is provided for in the plans, because there's other considerations, social, economic, et cetera, that need to be taken into account. So based on studies and modeling that determines the supply available in one of these areas and then what's needed for the environment, they determine what allocation limits need to be set to protect those environmental water requirements or water provisions within the area. And then based on those allocation limits, they set rules for things like water licensing. So how are existing water users going to be brought under a licensed regime? A few interesting aspects about the water licensing are that if it's determined that a particular area is above its allocation limit, then these rules will prescribe a process by which existing water users have to have their water takings ratcheted back so that it can be within that sustainable limit. And so as you can imagine, this is a very challenging, difficult process that they have to go through in some areas. Another interesting aspect that they're starting to move to in South Australia is that we're used to seeing licensing and permitting of water taking that is basically gives the water user, sets a maximum volume of water that they're allowed to take in a given day or a given year. What they're starting to move forward with in South Australia, and similar to other parts of Australia, is something that they call a share-based allocation. So water users within a particular catchment will be given a share of the resource, and at 100% of the share, that would equal a certain volume of water. But each year, or at a regular interval, the state will provide information on the amount of water that's available for the upcoming year, and that may mean that license holders receive only a portion of their share for that following year. So, and we'll get into this a little bit more in a talk I'm giving later on the situation in Ontario, but it's an interesting solution to a situation where there's not enough water to go around and decisions have to be made about who gets water and who doesn't. So this is a system that they've come up with that helps to resolve that. Another thing that helps them to resolve that is implementing rules around water trading. And so just to be clear, this isn't the physical movement of water from one user to another, it's trading the right to take water from one person to another. And so the plan will allow this. It'll set rules for how trades can be made and where they can be made so that they can do things, for instance, like prevent a trade that would result in more water being taken from an area that's already under stress. So, and it may actually have rules to encourage trading outside of those areas that are under stress to try and alleviate the stress in that area. And then just a couple other things that the plans have to include. rules for things that they refer to as water affecting activities. So these are things like rules for constructing wells or water bores, as well as rules around constructing dams and other things that would affect the flow of water in a particular area. And lastly, an important element of the plan is monitoring requirements. So these would be monitoring requirements on the individual water users to meter and report how much water they use in a given period, but also monitoring requirements around ecosystems, sensitive ecosystems in the area, and surface water flows, groundwater levels, all information that can be used to inform updates to the plans that are required to be considered every 5 years. Okay, so I just wanted to return back to this figure just to highlight the aspect of the water allocation process that I was interested in looking at through my research. Under the Natural Resources Management Act, consultation is required at a couple points in the process. The Natural Resources Management Board will prepare something they call a concept statement that basically outlines what they're proposing to be the contents of the plan. So they'll go out and consult publicly on that, and that basically means, you know, advertising in the newspaper, holding some public meetings around the area, and then based on that consultation, and once they prepared a draft plan with draft policies, they'll go out and do that public consultation again before they reach a final allocation plan that's then approved by the minister responsible for this act. But what's interesting to me is just this aspect that I've circled down here, and that's in addition to technical investigations that are done usually by the department feeding into the water allocation plan, a lot of the natural resources management boards are putting together advisory committees of local water users and other people who are interested in the local water resources to help inform the allocation planning process. And as Rob mentioned this morning, this is kind of indicative of a trend we're seeing towards more of this type of collaboration happening, and this is the aspect that I was interested in looking at. And I'd just like to take a minute to explain why. And Rob gave some of the reasons why collaboration is some of the benefits that it provides this morning. And there's broad support certainly in literature and in theory for collaboration, and we're seeing it increasingly in practice. One aspect of collaboration generally can help us solve complex problems. So these problems that involve not only technical challenges, but also some of these value issues that come into play, and water is certainly one of those. But a specific area that collaboration can help with is in bringing together multiple forms of knowledge. You know, one term in the academic literature, at least, this is referred to as joint fact-finding. It can achieve a few things, such as pulling in multiple sources of information and not just, you know, Western science and science produced by the state departments or provincial departments. It can help to develop a more robust understanding of the problem. So mixing that state understanding with local and landholder knowledge, indigenous knowledge about particular issues and particular challenges. Importantly, if joint fact-finding is done properly and meaningfully, it can create among the participants in a collaborative process like a common understanding of the problem, but also they can agree on the knowledge and the information that is going to be used to inform the policies that end up in their plan. And this all helps to go towards sort of building buy-in to the plan and the policies moving forward through its implementation. And then the last thing here is building social capital. And what I mean by that is just helping the people involved in a process understand each other's perspectives more, so helping government scientists understand local landholder and growers' perspectives, and vice versa. And it also helps to build trust among those people, again, moving forward through implementation of the plan and possibly, you know, revisiting the plan in the future. So this all sounds really great in theory, and there certainly have been examples where this has been applied successfully. But there's also been, from this joint fact-finding, producing knowledge perspective, there seem to be some significant challenges. And a lot of those challenges revolve around just differences among the participants in their view of the world and what they think constitutes valid knowledge. So you'll get, you know, a common example of an issue will be the department, whether it's the province or a state, coming to the table with some regional modeling that's been done based on sort of a scattered set of data points. And the modeling results not being consistent with what a local landholder might be experiencing at their property or within their watershed. So this difference in understanding can create problems and sort of prevent achieving some of those outcomes that joint fact-finding are purported to produce. So what I was interested in doing is using South Australia as an opportunity to test this type of collaboration in practice. And so, yeah, that's a little bit of background as to why I did what I did during my PhD. To approach the problem, I looked into there's tons of academic literature on joint fact-finding, and I used that to identify an evaluation framework that, just in short, shows the types of outcomes that we would expect to achieve from a collaborative process that is done meaningfully and properly, and then some of the important process criteria that you would want to see in that process to help to achieve some of these outcomes. So things like having the scientists that are generating the information at the table with the group and with the other participants so that they can communicate directly with the people involved in the collaborative process. Trying to avoid things like technical jargon so that people are speaking a common language. Having facilitators involved in the process that have what's referred to as interactional expertise. So being able to bridge the gap, help scientists understand the local perspectives and vice versa. Also having what's referred to as boundary experiences. So going on a field trip where the scientists and local landholders go out together and talk about what they're seeing from each of their perspectives. Also, being able to incorporate the use of local knowledge, whether it's sort of observations like local data or just anecdotal experiential knowledge that can feed into the process. And then lastly, having an authentic dialogue. And what I mean by that is not simply having scientists come in and present their results as sort of final and given, having an opportunity to debate that knowledge and again have an exchange so that the local landholders or other stakeholders involved in the process have the opportunity to question the knowledge and point out aspects of that where they see some incompatibility with their understanding of the issue. So I just wanted to explain a little bit about my specific case study areas. So I was based in Adelaide, Australia, which is in South Australia, right at the south central part of the country. And I chose 4 case study areas around Adelaide. My main criteria in choosing those areas was that their water allocation planning process needed to be far enough along that they had a well-established advisory committee, and they had also gotten to the stage where they're beginning to produce policies. Not necessarily a full final plan, but at least starting to discuss policies. And so I chose these 4, the Barossa Valley area and the Western Mount Lofties Ranges area down here. Those processes were being run by the Adelaide and Mount Lofty Ranges Natural Resources Management Board. And then the Marne Saunders and Eastern Mount Lofty Ranges areas were being run by the South Australia Murray-Darling Basin Natural Resources Management Board. So I just included a few photos from those areas just to highlight some of the water issues that were happening at the time. The bulk of South Australia's population lives in this area, and so the main economic production is in the area, mainly because of its close proximity to the capital city of Adelaide. A lot of water, these types of pipes are running all over the countryside, and a lot of water for that area is being imported from the Murray River, both to support Adelaide's water supply, but also to support irrigation in places like the Barossa Valley. So you're driving along the side road and there's these just pipes all over the place. So that's a significant component of water supply in the area. And also a number of the catchments in around Adelaide feed these large reservoirs that are supply drinking water and public water supply to metropolitan Adelaide. So around my case study areas, there are some urbanized portions and some of those areas are growing, but it's still predominantly agriculture. There's a few industries in the area, some mining and some commercial forestry, but otherwise mainly agricultural. Viticulture is dominant in the Barossa Valley and a few other areas around the case study areas that I looked at. But other areas include fruit orchards, cattle for dairy and beef, sheep, and then things like olives and almonds in certain areas of the area as well. I guess one of the most dominant features, though, is that the area can get extremely dry, and it certainly was in 2007 and 8 when I arrived. This figure shows inflows to the Murray River, but these are certainly indicative of the conditions that were in the Adelaide area at the time. So the top bar shows the average, long-term average inflow to the Murray River. The second line is basically the 10 years average preceding 2007. And then the black line at the bottom was the year before I arrived. So you can see that particularly around this time of year, it's at about 10% of their usual inflow. And then when I arrived right around here, it had a little bit of improvement earlier that year, but then it certainly dipped down and was just as bad for the rest of the year as it was in 2006. So extremely dry, and this is indicative of, I think, what turned out to be about a 10-year drought in Australia. So a couple of photos just to illustrate that on the ground in the study areas. This picture on the left is from a dam for a vineyard in the Barossa Valley early in the summer. Much lower, as you can see, than it should be. The vineyard manager that I met with and spoke with that day had said that they were probably going to be looking at about less than half of their typical yields for that year, for the third year in a row. And another feature is a lot of the streams in South Australia are ephemeral, so temporary. So an important ecological or aquatic ecosystem issue there is that a lot of aquatic species survive in these sort of refuge pools that exist during the dry seasons. And so an important aspect of water allocation planning is making sure that they're protecting the flows that end up in these pools so that those species can be protected. So what did I do exactly? I interviewed people. I talked to about 65 different people, state scientists, state policy people, but mainly the farmers and other stakeholders that were involved in the advisory committees. I looked through numerous documents, the plans, the studies behind the plans, meeting minutes, meeting agendas, all that kind of stuff. And then I observed. So I went to a number of the advisory committee meetings, and I went on a number of field trips with the committees to sort of see the process happening firsthand. And so I looked at these three data sources, and I looked for evidence from the evaluation framework that I showed you of the different process and outcome criteria being present in the different areas. And so this is a extremely highly simplified picture of what I found, but I wanted to use it just to highlight a couple of important things. So across the four areas, I certainly found evidence that the process had developed an understanding of the issues and the science and the information that was being produced for the plan. There was a high awareness of uncertainty associated with that information, and there was a high degree of social capital developed, so trust among the people involved, and certainly a better understanding of each other's perspectives around water and water management. And this isn't surprising because I also found in these areas, all of these areas, evidence that the scientists were involved directly in the process. There were facilitators involved that were effective at facilitating communication among the people involved. Most of the groups did things like field trips and those types of boundary experiences I mentioned. But the one difference was there was only one area, and that's the Marne area, where I found strong evidence that the group accepted and agreed to the pool of knowledge that was being used to inform their policies. In all of the other areas, there was a lot of disagreement still about the information they had on the resource that were being used to support the plan. And this is extremely important when you think back to some of the issues I mentioned about setting environmental water provisions and determining how much water was available for existing water users. People in these areas that are red didn't necessarily agree with what had been identified as the amount of water needed for the environment, or the amount of water that different types of crops were required. And those types of numbers were being used to determine how much existing water should receive through the licensing process. So the one difference that I found to explain this outcome in the Marne area versus the others was that the Marne process took the time and took the effort to have that, what I referred to earlier as an authentic dialogue about the knowledge that was being produced for that process. So the scientists would come to the table and present their results, but then there was opportunity for the local participants to question those results, to challenge those results. There are a number of instances where the department scientists would then go back and rerun models and add additional local data to improve and to sort of reach agreement on that information. And it was also an opportunity just for those scientists to be able to explain to people who didn't necessarily agree to it why it was inconsistent with their understanding, and sometimes that was enough to resolve an issue. So that was probably, that one difference was probably the most pronounced difference between these areas, and so it's not surprising that it was the only area where they'd been able to achieve that outcome. So I was a bit surprised by the number of people I met in South Australia who knew about Ontario and knew about our geography and how much water we have here. And so it probably shouldn't have been surprising when most of those people would say, you know, mate, why is someone from Ontario interested in coming to Australia and learning about water management? And I guess how I answered it then, and I've had a chance to reflect on it, but I think it's important to remember that drought is a relative concept. A definition of it that I like says something to the effect of drought is a departure from a long-term average hydrologic condition that like a region or a society has grown used to. So by Ontario standards, we do experience drought, and we talked about it this morning. We're probably all familiar with Ministry of Natural Resources Low Water Response Program, but they, along with our CAs, measure low water conditions according to precipitation and stream flow. And so here's a map from last summer showing large parts of southern Ontario under varying degrees of low water conditions, including large areas in eastern Ontario that had reached level 3 according to MNRF's indicators at least. So while we're blessed with a lot of water in Ontario, it's evident that there's areas of Ontario that face stress and are vulnerable to scarcity and stress. And we also talked this morning, we heard from Al about some of the projections for Southern Ontario around climate change. And we know that the population is growing and economic growth is continuing, certainly in some parts of Southern Ontario. So when you take all of this into account, it sort of raises the question about, is our existing water quantity management framework, our existing water taking policies adequate to deal with these pressures moving forward? So we can look to places like Australia, like South Australia, and where they've been forced to innovate, forced to try some new things because they're dealing with stress, and see if some of those things have merit here in Ontario. We need to be careful not to just sort of transplant an idea or an approach from one area and bring it to Ontario. There's a lot of factors to consider. But is it, for example, is it worthwhile at least considering the merits of a share-based approach to permitting or allocating our water in Ontario versus the approach we have now? The recent controversy and actions around water bottling in Ontario remind us that water management isn't strictly a technical challenge. It's not strictly a technical issue. There's a lot of values associated with that. People have strong opinions about how water should be used and which water uses should be prioritized over others. So all of that suggests that maybe looking at an area-based approach where you bring water users together to make decisions about how water should be used in an area might make a lot of sense in Ontario. Just before I leave this, the one other lesson I wanted to share was that a lot of people I talked with in Australia, the farmers who are involved in the committees, the policy people in the department, the scientists, all agreed that they wish they hadn't waited so long to prescribe the water resources when they did, because a lot of them were facing extremely tough situations of needing to ask existing users to cut back on their water use in order to protect ecosystems and allow for future population growth and economic growth in those areas. So a lot of people said they wish they'd prescribed the resource a lot sooner so that they could have taken action to protect those resources more proactively. So last, I'd just like to finish by pointing out a few things that I learned from my research in particular that I think are important to remember for collaborative processes. And these aren't necessarily collaboration around water quantity management or water use. They could be collaborations around water quality, any environmental issue that involves bringing people together and producing knowledge, trying to integrate technical information with local knowledge. Again, it's critical to have scientists at the table, so communicating directly with the people involved. I found from my examples that it was helpful to have the same scientists there throughout the process so that trust and appreciation of each other's perspectives could be developed. It was also important that you don't just have scientists there, but the scientists need to know how to communicate and be effective at communicating their scientific and technical understanding to local landholders and other stakeholders. Again, it's important to have facilitators involved in the process with that interactional expertise that I talked about. It's important to create opportunities to collect local knowledge. It was difficult in the South Australia examples because a lot of the process was prescribed and predetermined in South Australia's legislation. So the legislation determined generally what the plan needed to cover and what types of technical investigations needed to be done. So that sort of led to most of the work being done by department scientists. But there were still opportunities created where local landholder monitoring, stream water quality, water quantity, like flow, well levels, that was able to feed into the process. So in initiating a collaborative process, it's useful to think about opportunities to incorporate that type of knowledge directly into the process. I've kind of highlighted this point because, again, it's what stood out in that Marne-Saunders area, that committee had the opportunity to debate that knowledge and influence the knowledge that ultimately informed their policy. So that's a critical aspect. And then lastly, like when I think about this from the government's perspective, if we want to initiate a collaborative process, it's important to think about having all of these things involved. And what was really evident from these case studies is that takes more time and it takes more resources because you need to have, instead of those scientists being in the labs, they need to be down at meetings and out in the community meeting with landholders. You need to have effective facilitators involved. You need to set up processes for integrating knowledge, integrating local knowledge, and you need to take the time to have that debate of knowledge. So all of this takes time and resources. So if us at the province are interested in setting up a collaborative process and we want it to be meaningful, then it's important to make sure we allow enough time and resources to get it done properly. Yeah, I guess just the last thing I want to leave you with is that when we're talking about collaboration, especially around sort of water allocation, water management, it's important to just pay attention to knowledge in general, because it's obvious from my research and from everything I've read about this that knowledge is a critical part of the process. If the people involved in the process don't agree on the knowledge that's being used to determine the policies and that will ultimately influence how much water they're allowed to take and what types of meters they're required to install to measure their water taking, then there isn't going to be buy-in to those policies, and it's going to make enforcement and implementation of those policies even more challenging going forward. So, thank you.
If there's any specific questions about your presentation now, we can take one or two, and then we are going to have a panel after, so you can ask some more questions to them as well. If there's any quick questions, yeah?
Brent, that was a very nice presentation. Glad we went down there. Maud Barlow, in her last book, I think she's got a trilogy of books on water, she states access to plentiful, safe, healthy water and sanitation is now a United Nations human right. She had a chapter that described the Australian experiment as anything but successful. There are problems still out there. Those with go with water, and those without go without water.
And I haven't read that, but it's interesting. We may get into this a bit more in the panel, but and as I said at the beginning, I think there's things we can learn from Australia, but I think those aren't always success stories. I think there's some challenges they face, and I can only guess, but one aspect that might relate to that comment is the system of water trading. And a good example is in the Adelaide Hills, where trading has been initiated. I spoke to a number of people who expressed concern. Let me back up for a sec. One of the theories around a water market is that it helps you allocate water to the highest value uses. So that's the theory. But what's happening in the Adelaide Hills area is that an area that was predominantly growing stone fruit previously, relatively small family farms growing stone fruit, the water licenses and water rights in those areas are being bought up by large vineyards and large wine companies. So arguably, yes, the water is being used ultimately by purposes that are generating more money, but it's changing the social fabric of the Adelaide area. So that maybe doesn't relate directly to the sort of water as a human right and for basic needs, but it does reflect, I guess, some side effects of some of the approaches that Australia is taking. So just an example.
Carefully that you didn't approve of anything. You just pointed out the facts. So I thought that was a very clever way of describing the situation.
Oh.
Can I add to that? Because the water, when you say most those who have it, the water rights were allocated on the basis of historical use. So if you had water before, you continue to have water. And then you can sell it to the highest bidder. You don't have to sell it. You can keep it. Then you can choose to sell it because of the value. But because it was allocated on historical use basis, people have indigenous groups got no water out of it. They have no control over it. So it's absolutely true.
Did you talk to the farmers about time? So I noticed one of the things is you had to give them time and resources, and you had to have this integrated approach where they had time to debate and all that kind of stuff. But I think of all the people that represent the organizations here, time, in addition to your regular job of being a farmer and farming pigs or chickens and cash crops and all those other things, in addition to all these other things, starts to become a burden. And from a government perspective, I look at it and say, who do we have at the table, and do we have the right people speaking at the table on behalf of water for agriculture? And that's no disrespect to anybody in this room, but sometimes when you're crunched for time, you may not get perhaps the influencer in the ag community or in the government community that you need to make those changes and be able to have those debates.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm just wondering, if it's a bit of my rant and my whine, but did any of the farmers say, I just don't have time to be participating in all of this stuff?
Yeah, that certainly was brought up. I can think of a couple examples that I think might help to answer that. In the Marne area where I found success, people commented about the time commitment, but this is generalizing, but I would say that they felt that their time was being used effectively, it was being used efficiently, so they were coming to a meeting, and because the hydrologist and the ecologist were sitting at their table, they could have their questions answered and they could have a discussion with them on the spot. Versus one of the other areas, the Western Mount Lofty Ranges area, where there was a lot of concern and complaints about the time the process was taking, the wasted time. If someone said he was sick of going to meetings and just eating mints and listening to bureaucrats from downtown presenting stuff, so in that case, there was more resentment that their time was being wasted because they'd ask questions, and because the scientists weren't always there, they would go away feeling like they haven't, their time hadn't been used effectively. So, but even in the areas where I did see success, there was concern expressed about that. And the only other thing I want to mention is around the issue of providing local knowledge. A common thing I heard from the local landholders was that an important aspect of them being willing to provide their knowledge was being able to see something back in return. So I'm not wearing my Ministry of Environment hat right now, but the question came up this morning about the Provincial Groundwater Monitoring Network and whether there was analyses done of trends, et cetera, and then reported back publicly. There isn't that done. And so that's something in Australia that people wanted to see. I'm happy to do monitoring on my property and provide that information, but I want to see something back. I want to see something about conditions in my catchment, for example. And so I think that relates a little bit to time. Just wanting to see that there's value coming out of it. Yeah.